Jesus has just told one of his most famous parables, the prodigal son, only to now tell one of his most baffling parables, the dishonest manager. How do you make sense of this parable where Jesus seems to be telling his disciples to emulate the behavior of a swindler? Well, this is how Jesus begins this unusual story. There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, "What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager." Well, this puts this manager in a very difficult spot. He says to himself, what am I going to do? My master is getting ready to take the management away from me, and I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg. So this is what he says. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So here's what this guy does. He begins to summon in all of the master's debtors, and he would ask them, how much do you owe the master? For instance, he asked one guy, how much do you owe? And the guy says, well, 100 measures of oil. He said, take your bill, write down 50. Then he asked another to come in and ask him, well, what about you? And this guy says, well, I owe him 100 measures of wheat. He said, take your bill and write down 80. And then Jesus says this, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Well, that's baffling. What possible moral lesson could be drawn from this story? Most commentators, when looking at this particular parable, they will tell you that what Jesus is doing is he is instructing not only the disciples, but you and me as well, to be clever like the dishonest manager. We're not to be dishonest as he was. But the question I raise to you is, how do you separate being clever from being dishonest within this story? And more to the point, this idea of being clever or not dishonest, this understanding of this particular story, it really does not explain Jesus' conclusion to the parable. Jesus ends this story by telling his disciples, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. What does being clever have to do with making friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth? Jesus said to do this so that when this unrighteous wealth fails, these same people will receive you into eternal dwellings. Just exactly what are eternal dwellings? What is going on in this parable? Well, there's more to this parable than just being clever. But listen, before I unpack this particular story, I need to point out, and this is very important to understand, I need to make you aware that Jesus' parables as a whole, they were not intended to be general morality tales as how the disciples or you and me, how we could live life in a successful way. We tend to look at these parables as life lessons. But Jesus' parables were pronouncements of coming judgment and change. Jesus was warning Israel in particular to repent and to accept its new king, Jesus, or else fall under ultimate condemnation of God. Much of what Jesus taught, including his parables, was aimed directly at the pre-AD 70 crowd. When I say pre-AD 70 crowd, what I'm talking about is this. AD 70 is when Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed by the Roman army. Thousands upon thousands of Israelites were slaughtered. Only a few escaped. Without reading the parables in light of AD 70, They are often misunderstood and thus misapplied. And to understand the parable of the dishonest manager, you will need to see it in light of the coming judgment in AD 70. Otherwise, it's baffling. It really makes no sense. And you are left with this clever but don't be dishonest approach. So, with this in mind, let's take a look at this parable now and let's set the context. When Jesus is telling this story, this particular parable, he has shifted his audience from the crowds and the ever eavesdropping Pharisees. Remember, Pharisees are always looking in, they're listening to what's going on. But in this instance, Jesus is only talking to his disciples. It is a private conversation. Jesus is teaching the disciples valuable insights as to how they should position themselves when the day of judgment comes. This parable is making clear that a time of reckoning had come. In the story itself, the manager's dishonesty was exposed, and he was being called to give an account, and then he would be fired. And the same was true in relationship between God and Israel. Israel was being called to give an account. This is what Jesus was doing with so much of his teaching and his parables. He was calling Israel to give an account, and they too, like this dishonest manager, they too would soon be fired. So let's get into this parable now that we've got a little bit of the background. The difficulty in this story lies with the fact that the manager of the rich man's house, which you might say is the hero of the story, is clearly called dishonest. And yet the master of the house praises this dishonest manager for his actions. The dishonest manager, think of the word manager, the particular word manager, it's the Greek word oikonomos. It comes from two words, oikos meaning house and nomos meaning law or rule. The house ruler, the one that rules the house. This dishonest manager realizes that the time of reckoning for his dishonesty has come. He is going to have to give a full accounting and then will soon be cast out of the master's house. He will also have no means to make a living once he's gone and removed from the house. So what does he do? He calls in some people who owe money to the master and he lowers their debt. In so doing, he is giving himself time in which he can devise a plan to find a place to live and a way to protect his future. This is what he said. I have decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. This dishonest manager was securing favor with his master's debtors. He will now have a bunch of happy friends everywhere who also will now owe him some large favors. And when the master realizes what this manager has done, he commends him for being shrewd. This dishonest manager has saved himself from homelessness that was soon coming. And it's at this point that Jesus gives an explanatory note to this parable. This is what he says. The sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Look at that phrase, the sons of this world. That is not really a precise translation. The sons of this world should actually be the sons of this age. That particular word world is the Greek word aeon, which translates age. It is not the Greek word cosmos, which means world. Jesus, when he refers to the sons of this age, he is referring to the age which would soon be ending. That is, the sons of this generation. And remember, Jesus is telling this particular parable privately to his disciples. He is clearly letting them know that they would need to be willing to write off some short-term losses for long-term gains and security in the near future. This is why he tells the disciples, Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Jesus is not saying to pursue unjust business practices. He is not saying that all of worldly wealth is unrighteous. He is instructing his disciples to make friends within the marketplace of shrewd dealers. And by the way, this is exactly what Jesus had been doing, and it's the very thing that would really gall the Pharisees, and they would openly criticize him. Just before he tells this story of the dishonest manager, he tells those very famous parables, the one of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. Well, right before he begins those stories, this is what Luke records. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Jesus knew that the disciples would need in the near future a network of friends and connections. Not to write down debts, not to secure money, because he had already stated and made clear that money would eventually fail. But when it fails, the friendships remain, and these friendships would prove to be invaluable. This is what Jesus had been doing when it says that the sinners were drawing near to him and that he was receiving them and the tax collectors. That word receive means he's welcoming them into his network. He is bringing these people in all around him, and the Pharisees hated it. And he's instructing his disciples, in essence, to do the very same. Just as this dishonest manager had made friends to be received into their houses, Jesus is now instructing his disciples to make friends among the unrighteous wealth. Think tax collectors. Think sinners. Think Gentiles. In order to be received, if you will, into what Jesus called eternal dwellings. So, what are eternal dwellings? Well, to answer this, we need to keep in mind that Jesus is telling this parable specifically to the disciples. I know I've already said this once, but it needs to be repeated. This was a private conversation. This parable was not told to the crowds. This parable was not told to the Pharisees or the scribes. This parable was only for those who openly embraced Jesus, not for those who had rejected him and thus destined to be destroyed. Jesus knew that the day of reckoning upon unbelieving Israel was coming, and it was coming very soon, and only the remnant would get out. Like the dishonest manager who would survive being tossed out of the master's house, the disciples would likewise survive when they, in effect, would be tossed out of Jerusalem. And once outside of Jerusalem, these disciples would be looking for new places to live. They were going to need new connections, and Jesus knew this. He knew they would need new friends when this new age came. The rest of faithless Israel, they would be dead, captive, or left to the dogs. And Jerusalem itself, together with the temple, it would be leveled to the ground. So Jesus is telling these disciples, his disciples, privately, to make friends among the unrighteous wealth. Again, think tax collectors, think sinners, think Gentiles. So that when this unrighteous wealth fails, think the Roman overthrow in AD 70, that overthrow of Jerusalem, and everyone's gone, and the disciples are outside, they would be received into eternal dwellings as a result of the friendships they had made. But what are these eternal dwellings? Well, this word eternal, it's the Greek word aionios, and it's often translated eternal or everlasting. But it can also be understood as something that is perpetual or continuing, not necessarily never-ending, something that would go on for a very long time. Now, we know that Jesus' death and resurrection ushered in a new covenant. But you need to understand, this new covenant would not be fully realized until the old covenant, with all of its symbols, was officially gone. And the destruction of Jerusalem and the leveling of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70 marked the official end of that old covenant. Jesus had died and had been resurrected. People were coming into faith in Jesus, but Jerusalem and the temple, it still stood and would be there for a number of years. But in AD 70, all of that would be gone. That would be the sign, the official sign of the end of the old covenant. And with that old covenant forever gone, the disciples would need, in a figurative sense, a new place to live, together with new friends. They would need eternal or perpetual, continuing dwellings. Now, that second word, dwelling, it's also very revealing. While the dishonest manager in the parable is hoping to be received into people's houses, oikos, that's the Greek word for house, the disciples are expected to be received not in oikos, houses, but rather in eternal dwellings. Dwellings. It's the Greek word skene. This word skene is used to depict temporary dwellings like a tent or tabernacle. Jesus is telling his disciples that they will be received in a perpetual or a continuing tent or tabernacle once this new age has fully come into its own following the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And skene, meaning tent or tabernacle, generally refers to a skin tent or a fleshly body. Now, here's what's really fascinating. When the apostles assembled at the first general council that you read about in Acts 15, they considered the addition of Gentiles into the church as fulfilling Amos's prophecy of a restored tabernacle, that is, the tent or skene of David. This was a big deal. You got to understand, Paul and Barnabas have just come back from their first missionary journey that you read in Acts 13 and 14. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Gentiles had come to faith in Jesus. Churches are being established all around Jerusalem, all around in the world as they understood it at that time. And there was a huge question as to what to do with these Gentiles. A lot of the Jewish believers back in Jerusalem were saying, listen, these Gentiles, the males, they need to be circumcised or they will not be considered a part of the church. And this became a huge, huge issue. What do you do with these Gentiles? And of course, we know that ultimately the decision that was made at that Jerusalem council, recorded in Acts 15, that circumcision was no longer applicable. That was part of the old covenant. We are now in the new covenant where it's faith and faith alone in Jesus. So when James gets up, and he's the leader at this point, he gets up and explains all this, and then when he's speaking to the council, he quotes Amos 9. This is what he said. After this, I will return. I will rebuild the tent. That's the Greek word skene. I will rebuild the tent of David that has fallen. I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, and the remnant of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from of old. What was James doing here when he was quoting from Amos 9? He was letting the people know that the addition of the Gentiles was fulfilling this prophetic word that Amos gave centuries earlier. James considered the New Testament church with the inclusion of the Gentiles as the fulfillment of the restored tabernacle of David, the restored skene, the true remnant of Israel. So to sum up, Jesus is telling the disciples by way of this parable of the dishonest manager, They need to now begin to make friends for themselves by means of unrighteous wealth. In other words, they're going to need a new network of friends and connections. And this new network of friends and connections would prove invaluable when Jerusalem, together with the temple, would fall in AD 70. And it's then that they would be received into eternal dwellings, that is, continuing tents, the restored tabernacle of David. People, that's the church. That's what's going on here. Jesus is instructing the disciples to seek continuing dwellings among unrighteous wealth, the Gentiles. And what Jesus was expecting would become a reality. His disciples would continue to live beyond the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple because they did indeed develop new relationships with the Gentiles within the eternal dwelling, the church. You remember that very famous moment in Acts 10 when Peter is led by the Spirit to go into the house of Cornelius? A Gentile. This was huge. This was a turning point for Peter. And then later, when Paul, in his 3 missionary journeys, taking the good news of Jesus to the world and thousands of Gentiles coming in. It's all of what Jesus was getting at when he's telling this parable of the dishonest manager. I know this parable can be very confusing and very baffling, but when you see it in light of the fact that, one, it was given only to the disciples. It was a private conversation, and it's to be understood in the context of the coming destruction and judgment upon Israel, which actually happened in AD 70. Then it starts to make sense. The parable of the dishonest manager takes on new meaning. The disciples were beginning to prepare for the day when they would need to get out of Jerusalem, and they, like the dishonest manager, they would need to develop new relationships with the Gentiles during the brief interim before judgment ultimately fell on AD 70, and this new age, the new covenant, came into its own, came into its fullness. I believe this is what we have in this particular parable, the parable of the dishonest manager. Well, listen, I hope this has been helpful, and if it has, take a moment, if you will, just to hit that like button. And again, if you've not yet become a subscriber to this channel, I would really appreciate you doing that as well. Just hit that subscription button. Again, this parable of the dishonest manager, it's a fascinating story. But I believe that when you see it in light of the fact that it was given privately to the disciples, and it was preparing them for a time when the ultimate judgment that Jesus had been talking about over and over again with his teaching and his parables that would soon be coming on Jerusalem, when it did come into play in AD 70, the disciples themselves, they were prepared, they were ready. Well, listen, thanks for watching, and as always, God's very best to you.